First of all, I still want to do St. Louis Art Museum trip. And when I was starting to put something together for available dates, and all of a sudden I'm swamped with Easter egg hunts. So kind of what I was thinking though was that probably the best days would be on a Saturday or a Sunday on my schedule. And I'm assuming you guys have classes Monday through Thursday typically. So Friday might be a thing, but anyway, my schedule filled up, so I'll get that straightened out and take a poll online and see when I can get most of you, hopefully all of you, so we could schedule this. But at any rate, so you remember the last time we were here,
What are you talking about?
a visit to the St. Louis Art Museum.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I'd like to go there and bring as many people in a group as I can, but I'm having a little bit of difficulty scheduling.
Oh, okay.
But just as a show of hands, would Saturdays and Sundays be best for you guys? Yes, yes. Not Mackenzie?
Usually have work on those days.
Oh, yeah. See, I know you guys have lives and stuff. I know. Would Fridays be better?
Yeah, it depends on time. It's usually like after 4 I have work, so it could be like in the morning or like early evening. I would definitely do it.
Okay, I'll see if I can't get that one put on the schedule too. Fridays, that's one of the nice things about Maryville. It's a Tuesday, Thursday, Monday, Wednesday schedule. It's not like that everywhere. So, okay, I'll keep it in mind. So last time we were here talking to you about Impressionism and talked about photography and saw some of the early photography as it was portrayed in the book. And photography was like a big thing, and it was used for a lot of things. What happened in the Americas, at least in the United States, was that in the late 19th century, late 1800s, a lot of entrepreneurs bought a camera, bought a lot of silver nitrate glass plates, a covered wagon, and went across the countryside taking people's portraits. And so I don't know how much you guys do antiques and stuff, but it used to be real common to be able to see portraits, photographic portraits still around from the late 1800s. And they would put a big frame around them and stuff. You could make a lot of money like that. And that was kind of what happened. And then there were other things that happened. And one thing I want to show you today was a Victorian era, late 1800s through the early 1900s, like 1910-ish or so, was headless photography. And so this is what people were doing in the US, in Europe. Photographers, they kind of figured out how to do what we would call like 2 exposures, and you can do this quite easily now on a computer. Obviously, you can cut the head off, paste, put it like that, but they were figuring out how to do this with silver plate exposures. And so this was like a real craze. This was like really pretty cutting edge, funny stuff. See, as you see, 1890. And I got a lot of these from, well, I got some of these from a site called Before Photoshop, which was talking about the kind of things that they did with mechanical, not digital means. And so, yeah, headless portrait. And you see this guy, this is not a good pick, it's low res, but you can see pretty much what this is. Unknown headless woman. Unknown photographer, bearded man holds his severed head in his hand. And this is in France. This is in, I think this is in the UK. Anyway, you can see the head here, the servant serving his head on a plate. And this is another one, a guy who had presumably cut off his own head. Now, I got to tell you something. When I was looking for these to show you, I could not find these like I used to be able to find them on a Google search. Headless photography, 19th century Victorian headless photography. Used to go on Google Images and get tons of these things. Not so much anymore. And I'm kind of thinking that maybe, just maybe, they're not showing these on Google Images so much because a lot of these imply violence. You can see the knife with the blood and the severed head and the, dripping and stuff. So anyway, they did a lot of stuff back in the day. And let's see, here we go. Slideshow from beginning. Let's make sure I got the share. This is weird. Share sound. Where's my share screen? Oh, there. We can do that. And this is where we want to be. Okay, just making sure, guys, that we had it right. And I showed you all of this the last time we were around and talked about how these artists were trying to do some things that weren't particularly photographic, but they were analyzing the colors of things. They were analyzing composition and see, like all of this color, this is impressionistic, and you got white, you got blues, you got oranges and pinks and stuff. All of these colors that would make it believable, to be sure, but they are really not the local color. The local color would be like this. But at any rate, they were looking into things like the effects of light. And I told you that they started looking at Japanese art. And this was like the first time there was a major influence outside of Europe on European art. And so it showed you some of the women impressionists, Berthe Morisot and Toulouse-Lautrec, and this is pretty much where we stopped. And I was showing you how you could use flat areas of color, which is pretty reminiscent of the Japanese woodblock style. And so that was the first big influence. And they started taking some of this color analysis to new levels. They were actually doing this in a scientific way. This is a very famous painting. I'm hoping all of you have seen it. Sunday afternoon on La Grande Jatte. It's at the Chicago Art Institute. Again, all of these robber barons bought up all of this French art that at the time the French truly didn't appreciate. But this style is typically called pointillism. And what Seurat and a contemporary of his, a guy named Signac, they explored the idea of putting little spots of color on a canvas and putting them right next to each other and letting your eye mix the colors. So if you had, let's say you wanted to do something purple, you would put dark blue and put red dots next to each other. And it would come out, you would see it as purple. And you see some of that going on in here. It was kind of amazing. They were using science, they were using optics to choose their colors. And there was, in this era, which we call post-impressionism, because the impressionists are still working, but there are a lot of people moving on. It's almost as though the impressionists broke a lot of ground. They did a lot of new things, and then boom, if they could do all of this, if they could break from tradition in such a major way, maybe we can too. Maybe there's other areas to explore. And so that's what this is. And there is a parallel. What happens in this, I want to zoom in a little bit more here. In terms of color, and I was saying it was a scientific discovery. They wanted to bring science and technology into this. This becomes really pretty much the founding principle of like color TV. At least for a long time. Now we got LED TV and stuff, and there's a lot of things. But even on your printers, say, what do you get? What is your ink distribution? CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And from those four colors, they can make every color that you want to print. They were doing a lot of color theory. And as I was saying about color TV, the early color TV was very pixelated. And they basically had CMY. The black was the background, and you would get these tiny little pixels of a yellow, a red, or blue, cyan. And that's how color TV worked. It was based right on the the science, the optics that these late 19th century French painters discovered. And here is here's a better detail, better than I was getting with the zoom, but you can see how they put this together. Pointillism. And so, as I just said a moment ago, the Impressionists really broke with tradition. They were renegades. They went rogue. They went off the grid, as you might say. Bottom line, we have these people doing scientific analysis of color. We have another group that are using color and exaggerated form to convey emotions. And if you want to kind of go down this road a little bit, one of the things that they saw with photography was that photography itself was just, you had to have the subject and it was kind of dry. It was kind of what you might call a matter of fact representation. And so these artists were saying, wait a minute, we don't want to do all of this fooly eye, all of this stuff that had been going on since the Renaissance. There's something else that we can, quote, say through our art. Why did I use that word say? A while back, I started down this road of artists were writing their own narratives. And we saw that, especially with the realists, that they were pretty much going off the grid too. People like Courbet, The Funeral at Ornans, and all of this stuff going on, this big epic painting about an ordinary person from a small village, not important, and it's the burial. It's not like a big parade. It's not like the coronation of Napoleon and Josephine. It's like every day. And there were a lot of art snobs still yet at that day. It's like, you can't do that. Art is only for the important stuff. It would have this saying that this is not worthy of art. So Van Gogh, what does he do? He's doing everyday people. He's taken some of his cues from that realism that Courbet opened up. But he's doing this in a very exaggerated way. Look at the strong lights and darks, the brushwork, the coloration, the composition. Look at the exaggeration on his face. This is like way exaggerated. I'd say if you saw this guy and his bottom of his face was way up here and the back, you know what I'm saying. It's very much exaggerated. The potato eaters. Van Gogh, one of the most celebrated European artists of the late 19th century and maybe of all time. People love Van Gogh. And part of it, I think, has to do with it's pretty easily understood. Once your expectations have been shifted away from photographic realism, if you're not depending on the smoothness, the accuracy of the anatomy, the light source, the perspective lines, the off diagonals, it didn't use any of it. It's just there. And so he's really breaking ground yet again, even more than his predecessors and contemporaries. And I'd like to tell you a little bit of background about this piece. Van Gogh, Vincent van Gogh, was a Dutchman. And as a young man, he found himself called to be a minister. He wanted to minister to the poor people, the everyday people. And in Northern Europe up there, or in the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, that part of Northern Europe is like really rich in coal. There's a lot of coal there, just like you would find in West Virginia on this continent or Pennsylvania. And coal mining was what fueled the Industrial Revolution. Needed coal to make steel, but more than that, you needed coal to power industry. Everything was done with steam engines. We didn't have gasoline and diesel yet. And so even the trains were coal burners, steam locomotives. People burned coal in their homes. That was their heat, that was their furnace. And later on, that'll develop into steam heat, where you'd have a boiler in your basement, and the boiler would pump hot water up through the radiators, but it still needed fuel, and it was fueled by coal. And in fact, the use of coal was so great. For about 50 years here, the people were using coal more and more and more. And it got to a point where there were cities that were blanketed in what we would now call smog, smoke and fog, respiratory problems. There were all kinds of problems with, well, as you might guess, it was the beginning of this climate change. All of that fossil fuel being burned, boom. But at any rate, the people that mined this coal were typically poor. They were people that didn't have really any other life support. When you didn't have a skill, when you didn't have an education, you could provide for your families by working in the coal mines. And that's these people, the potato eaters. And you didn't make much money as a coal miner. In the US, in Europe, very low paying job, very dangerous job. And these people were so poor that all they could afford to eat, all they could afford to buy were potatoes. Potatoes were cheap. Potatoes were cheap, and they would last a long time without rotting. As long as you kept them cool and dry, you could keep potatoes for a long time. So it was like the sustenance food in Europe at the time. And so other cultures had other staple foods, like say rice, and wheat, those kinds of foods that would not spoil. But potatoes were basically what they lived on, and poured a little bit of coffee there too. And so here they are, dirty, poor, living on potatoes to pay the potato eaters. And so this was who Van Gogh wanted to minister to, and he started to memorialize them in oil paint. He started painting, and he was drawing, and he was doing all kinds of things. Well, he was kind of a radical preacher, and the church kicked him out. And he was too strong an advocate for these poor people, was really the issue. And so he went to Paris. And talking about that Japanese influence, here he is. Doing in 1887, it's 1885, 1887, he's in Paris, he's seeing Japanese art, and he's memorializing Japanese art. And these are, well, it seems like it's this time of year, we're starting to getting, the fruit trees are starting to flower now. And so it's his springtime, but you see, he's using a couple of things here in this. And one is painting a tree by just showing a part of it. And that was something that the Japanese artists were doing in a big way. They realized you didn't have to show the whole tree to convey the idea of a tree. So that's what you get here. Just a couple of branches, with the trunk being below, and some of the smaller branches being up above. But it's got the fence, the graveyard, and he's got this Japanese writing. And there was something else that the Japanese like to do too. And it's, there's a little bit of it up here. But they were not above actually combining words with their images. And in fact, a lot of Japanese and Chinese art, often the visual image contains a saying, a poem, a proverb, something. And so anyway, he's really looking at this, and that was, as I was saying, that was huge in Paris in the 1880s. And so just a year after that, Van Gogh decides that this is really what he wants to do. He wants to be a painter. He moves to the south of France, and he has a brother named Theo. This is a part of the lore of modern art too. He has a brother named Theo. Bottom line, Theo is an art dealer. Theo wants to help Vincent in his career, but Vincent's paintings aren't selling. They're probably a little too far beyond the traditional. As I was saying, all these people were really breaking with tradition, and this really started to break with tradition. And you can see he uses all of this color in a way that actually kind of evokes some kind of emotion. When we talk about this evokes an emotion too, this dark, strong light, this coloration. You get the idea that these people, it's dark, they're dirty, and they're poor. And in this, you got all this stuff. And I'm going to zoom in on this. And he's going for things that are like these lights, the lamps, the lighting in this pool room. They vibrate. And there have been a lot of artists and art historians talk about Van Gogh and this idea that everything has a life force, even inanimate objects, even light, even the floor, everything in here is animated. It has its own life force. Oh, this is bottom line. There have been a number of movies about Van Gogh too. This one here was from 1956, and Lust for Life, starring Kirk Douglas, Anthony Quinn, blah, 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 blah. And it was from the Irving Stone. Irving Stone was a guy that in the 40s and 50s actually went and looked at some of these artists and wrote about their life stories, and this film is based on his, oh, here it is, it says, based on a novel by Irving Stone. Bottom line is that by the 1950s, long after Van Gogh had passed away, all of this art, much of it was in the US, and by 50 years, 60 years after he died, it's really popular. I don't know if you guys got to see this. It was here a couple of years ago. Had a big tent out by the Galleria, and they had projectors, and they were taking images of Van Gogh's work and projecting them all over the walls and the floor and the ceiling, and kind of try to give you the experience, the immersive experience that you're actually like inside a Van Gogh painting. And you see though, this is his famous one, Starry Night. And by the way, there've been other movies about Van Gogh too. One of them I'd recommend is one called Vincent and Theo. And I think it was like about 25 years ago, 30 years ago. Really accurate. Anyway, but look at this, the Starry Night. And the idea of everything has its own life force. Look at this. This is this night sky, but it's not just the stars in the sky, which is the title of the painting, but they have all of this energy that they project, and the stars become swirling fireballs, the sky itself swirling. He's painted the wind in the night sky. He's painted all of everything, and then you got these cypress trees here, and they are blowing around in the wind. The hillside, it's not static. And he achieves a lot of this by doing some of that same kind of brushwork on a larger scale that you see with Seurat and the pointillist. And the idea of not so much about putting dots together to achieve color phenomena, but this long brushstrokes to create movement in what would ordinarily, and especially if you were to photograph this, would be still, inanimate. He puts life into all of this. And this is really, like I say, it takes the general public 50, 60 years to kind of come around to understanding this. But, and as you see, Museum of Modern Art, Yale University. As I say, we got a lot of these Van Goghs, and there's a museum in, wow, where is it? Amsterdam, I believe. The Van Gogh Museum. And they had come and try to reclaim a lot of their Van Goghs. These things, when they go on sale, fetch tens of millions of dollars. One of Van Gogh's sunflower paintings, this was 30 years ago, it was the highest price ever paid for a work of art at the time. It was bought by someone from Japan. It was like $40 million or something. So anyway, this is what Van Gogh does. He infuses, he paints the life forces in everything. And here is one of his contemporaries. Actually, in this film, Anthony Quinn, he plays this guy, Paul Gauguin. Paul Gauguin is another famous post-impressionist artist, and he's doing something a little different. He's
kind of doing some exaggerated forms. And I showed you that Van Gogh with that piece of the tree where you see the branch, where we just see the trunk or the higher branches. This is a direct reference to that Japanese art that so influenced those French painters. And one of the things about Gauguin was that he was really interested in the spiritual, the mystic, just the condition of life itself. And has all of these women in there here in prayer. This is how women of Northern Europe would dress at the time. This is not unusual. And if you would say, for instance, in America, we have the Mennonites, we have the Amish, they still dress in this traditional way. This is traditional farmers, wives and daughters, how they dress. And so a vision after the sermon, presumably they just got out of church and they see Jacob wrestling with an angel out here, a vision, spirituality. But look at this, this ground is red. And Gauguin himself talked about the symbolic significance of color. That is, that it would evoke an emotion in the viewer, as well as all of the exaggerated forms, but it carried all kinds of other significance. And I don't have this. As I talk about this stuff, I think, wow, there's some more stuff I'd like to show you. But one of Gauguin's famous works was a painting called The Yellow Christ. And it's a painting in this kind of exaggerated post-impressionist style, but Christ on the cross is yellow. Because, as I was saying about this red ground, carries its own significance. Red has a lot of meaning, as does yellow. But here's what he ends up doing. Gauguin himself, probably a little bit about him on personal level. He was basically what you might call in today's world an investment banker. And he made a lot of money. And he was living in the upper middle class lifestyle. And he had this kind of midlife crisis. He left his family, left his wife and children, and he just took off. Nobody knew where he went. Just had this thing. And he traveled around the world, and it wasn't like he traveled on luxury liners or anything. He would hop aboard freight ships. He ended up in the Panama Canal. You see, this is 1897. It was some time just before this. But you guys, history majors, anybody? Panama Canal was opened in 1903. But it had been a project the French were keen on building, and they gave up. In the 1880s and 1890s, they wanted to build the Panama Canal. They were not successful, but they sent a lot of workers down there, and that's where Gauguin ended up, working on the Panama Canal. And he left, came back, stayed with Van Gogh for a while. That's part of what the movie shows. And then he finally gets aboard a ship and ends up in Tahiti, South Pacific island culture. AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islanders. Yeah. And this Pacific Island culture
was actually a territory claimed by France. France was still a colonial power. And they had these colonies all over the world in Algeria and Tahiti and French Guyana and just different places. Anyway, Tahiti. And he found this to be paradise. And so this is a Gauguin painting, and you can see some of these words up here actually are what the title is. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? And when he got to Tahiti, he thought this was how humans were supposed to live, unspoiled by the Industrial Revolution, by Christianity, by all of this stuff that, as he saw it, corrupted European culture, the Americas, and most other cultures around the world via colonialism. And he thought these people were living in an idyllic state. And so you see the Tahitian women, and they basically go bare-breasted. And here's a Tahitian god. And he still liked to play with the color in a way, using what they would term symbolist color, that the colors actually represent other things other than the subject matter being depicted, but the fact that these people are yellow and this is a purple ground and all of this stuff significant. And so anyway, he became wildly successful. He started sending these paintings back to Paris, and the Parisians loved him. He was a guy that actually was successful in his own time. Unlike Van Gogh, who died young and relatively unknown, Gauguin was actually popular in the latter part of his life. And when he was sending these paintings back to Paris, there is an analogy here. I showed you Delacroix, the tiger home, the pictures of the odalisque, the harem rooms and stuff like that. All of these paintings, Gros, the pest house at Jaffa, all of this stuff. Europeans, especially Parisians, were really keen to see what the rest of the world was like, and this was extremely exotic, exotic, and people loved these paintings. And so he was kind of one of the major artists of this post-impressionist period. However, in the last 30, 40 years, his stock has gone down. Anyone want to guess why? Well, let me tell you. His stock went down because he is fascinated by nude young girls. Feminist art critics took another look at this and said, wait a minute. And this is kind of a more benign painting, but there are other ones that have really extremely sexualized these young Tahitian women. And so, yeah, it's kind of lost some value on that end, but at any rate, another artist of the time, Paul Cézanne, probably the last of the post-impressionists, and he's
kind of more interested in painting things as you see them, whether or not they conform to, as I was saying, tradition. And so he'd do something like this, a basket of apples. But, you know, these still lifes oftentimes were painted in such a manner that it would seem as though these apples would just roll off the table, because he'd tilt the table up to paint the still life. And so he was a guy, another human interest story. He'd won a lottery as an adult, and he had a lot of money. And so he became a painter just because it interested him. Didn't worry about having to sell his work or anything, but he was really interested in how he sees things. And that's what connects him with people like Seurat, who are trying to figure out how you see color. What Cézanne's interested in is how you see things, and outside his window was this exact scene, Mount Saint Victory. And this was looking out of his house, the chalet. And he puts this together in such a way that you can see this as maybe the mountain being stacked upon, on top of the middle ground, and then the foreground. And there are other Cézanne paintings that this happens in a more exaggerated way, but basically he's giving you the distance, the middle, and the foreground, all in the same level of focus. And because he does that, his paintings flatten out. They don't, you know that this Mount Saint Victory is far in the distance, but the way he paints it, and when you see the paintings, it just is flattened out. And the idea of flatness goes right back to the Japanese artists, who were not really interested in this idea of depth that had fascinated European artists for 400 years. And so here's what he does. He basically paints them in the same focus, and they're all three are pretty much out of focus. Two, he's just using brushwork and painting what he sees. And here are the bathers, and this, again, another reference to the Japanese artist of the day. But it loses a lot of its sense of form by painting what he sees. He sees the shine of these wet, nude bodies, but it doesn't, they don't seem to be like that naturalistic kind of painting that we've been so accustomed to see. And again, that cloud in this distance almost look like it's coming up to the fore. And this does actually flatten out quite a lot. And so that is Cézanne. And this kind of painting is what this Mount Saint Victory. This is what will influence George Braque and Pablo Picasso and Cubism. And if you know Cubism and you see this, you kind of start to see some of the early markings, if you will. And so I got some more here. There's a bunch of other people doing different kinds of things. For the record, Chavannes, Sacred Grove, there's still people doing tradition. They're not exactly doing it in the same way, but all of the other stuff that we've seen is still exists. Those guys like Cezanne and Van Gogh and Gauguin, they were, as I said, off the grid. This is the grid. This is what mostly people saw as French painting. And these are the kinds of paintings that you would see at the salon. And then there are other painters like Miro, and they start painting that kind of dreamscape stuff, things that happen only in the mind. This kind of painting of doing visions from the mind, from the imagination, whether or not you believe in the apparition or not, but this is seeing the face of Christ, whether you believe it or not. This will influence surrealism in the next century, in the upcoming century. You want to find out what you can paint that can't be done with a camera. You can do that dreamscape, and we'll see a lot of that. But this is really kind of the beginnings of that kind of painting. And here's another Miro, Jupiter and Semele. Kind of like traditional, but on steroids, on maybe, dare I say, it's almost like traditional religious painting on drugs. Just saying now, and I'm sure he didn't use drugs, but bottom line is like they're taking some of the tradition and dialing it up. And the Cyclops, and you see here, this is a person dreaming. The idea of dreams being the source of these fantastic images and ideas, that's a surrealist idea, and here we're doing it 1898. The Sleeping Gypsy, Rousseau. Another precursor of surrealism. And here he is out in the desert. The lion in its own way is kind of surreal itself. Kind of looks like a lion, kind of looks like a person too. But at any rate, Rousseau, The Dream, 1910. You have Paradise, this idea. James Ensor, Christ's entry into Brussels. And again, something out of the imagination. And we have this is called Art Nouveau, and which just really translate into new art. That's what it is. And so they're taking some of these elements of Japanese art, of these dreamscape artists, of the flatness, of the imagination. Another famous painting. And it has been documented that Edvard Munch actually saw some Van Gogh work. And he wanted to dial that up again. As I was saying about Van Gogh, everything has its own life force. Well, that's really happening here. Look at that sky, that red sky, and it's wavy, it's it's not. It's not static, it's got much movement, as does the harbor here. And the mountains back there. This is a pier. There's some boats here in the harbor. Exaggerated in color, exaggerated in shape. And in fact, it's almost as though his hands are defining the shape of his head. And it's kind of echoed in the mouth and the eyes. The screen, tempera pastels on cardboard, actually made a number of these. But anyway, this is a really famous painting. And to this point, this kind of achieves what a lot of those post-impressionists wanted to do. And that was touch the emotions of the view, to actually convey a message of emotion, in this case, terror. And it's still effective. I mean, you know, even though you can get coffee mugs and ties and things with this image, it's still, for a lot of people, it's that one painting that touches exactly how you feel. High anxiety. And again, they're really starting to spread out after the turn of the century. And by the way, just really, we're right in the midst of modernism. We can kind of take a look at all of these together. You can see the Impressionist, there's a lot of stuff that's kind of the same about their work. Manet, Monet, Caballot, Pissarro, Renoir, all kind of dealing with the same concerns. They're not being photographic, they're painting impression, but Degas again. But then you start to see at this point, the artists are doing radically different things, not one based on the other. In fact, they're spreading out in a whole bunch of directions. And again, the idea of photography and sculpture, walking man, no arms, no head. The idea that I was showing you with Japanese art, you didn't have to portray the whole thing to get the essence of what's being portrayed. You can do a whole tree by just doing a couple of limbs. You can do a whole man, especially to catch the operative part of walking. This is another one of those Rodin sculptures, and these guys, they were the burghers of Calais, and basically they are pretty much the city council, and they're all being put to death, and that's what they're doing. Some are facing up to it, some are blaming others, some are just sad, some are just remorseful. The burghers of Calais. And so now they're famous. And pretty much what you see with Rodin, and I don't have another better picture of it, but I can show you this point on the walking man, and that is
he was taking a lot of his ideas straight out of Impressionism. And instead of having a flat surface or a surface modeled in reality, he would do these different things with the surface to get all of this kind of light to reflect in all different kinds of ways, much in the same way that an impressionistic painter would use brushstrokes. And so they can add up to a walking man, but the surfaces of these are really quite irregular. And I want to show you this kind of little bit of the rest here. And green dining room. We're really starting to see the effects of modernism in architecture and design. And so that becomes a whole thing here. This, where we got it, I'm gonna see if I have this, oh, no. The Etruscan room, which is basically kind of like this. They're taking ideas from the past and putting them into the present. And you see all this kind of modern art design going on there. This rigid geometric chairs. Or on the other hand, excessive ornamentation. Check out that floor. Design. This is a Tiffany table lamp. And in architecture, they start to see the effects of the Industrial Revolution, because all of a sudden, as I was showing you during the Impressionist era, we saw some of the glass architecture from England. They didn't have to do straight up post and lintel architecture. And this guy, Gaudí, who's from Barcelona, he comes up with an idea that he's not going to use any straight lines in his architecture. Unlike what you would see here, which everything is a straight geometric. Everything is curvilinear. And so there are parallels. As I was showing you, the painters were doing things, they were spreading out, all doing different things. Same thing in architecture. And this, obviously, one of the engineering architectural achievements of the era, the Eiffel Tower. And this is an interesting thing. It still exists today. It was done for the Paris World's Fair, and it was designed, and they thought it was, they were going to take it down. It was only going to last like 20 years at the most. It was not permanent. It was just, it was a World's Fair kind of thing to show you what you could do with if you put steel together in the way that you would put Legos together today. You know, you can do some really cool stuff. And this was the highest structure in the whole world at the time. But it was so fantastically popular that in the 1910s, they rebuilt it. And it's permanent now. But this was such an architectural coup, if you will. This became to symbolize modernism in France. And we'll see when we start looking at Cubism, there will be a lot of painters referencing this Eiffel Tower. It becomes actually the living symbol for modernism. And in the US, we start to see the Industrial Revolution take place its effects here. This is in Chicago, Marshall Fields. And this one. No, not that one. This one. This is still here too. Hey, St. Louis is in the art history textbook. And this is still, you know, this is still here. This is a pretty recent picture. What happened is that these guys, Sullivan and Richardson, what they figured out was that walls didn't have to support the building. That's a new idea. Nobody ever thought about that. What supports these buildings are the steel framework that is made out of steel I-beams, and you can rivet those together, weld them together. You can assemble this, as I was saying, like a Lego, or like this. And it would, this is the superstructure. It is, that's all it is. But this basically post and lintel stacked on in top of each other. And all of this brickwork is just cosmetic. That's why you can have such large windows, how much window space you can have in here. Windows do not support weight. This is all new stuff in the 1890s. And St. Louis, by the way, was one of the premier cities in the US at that time. As a matter of fact, this is 1891. 1904, the World's Fair was held right here in St. Louis, as well as the Olympic Games. I mean, St. Louis was like huge back in the day. And this was part of what represented St. Louis greatness, this Wainwright building. Not Adam Wainwright, by the way. But this is still in use and it's owned by the city. And if you have a parking ticket or something in the city, this is where you go pay it. So it's a terracotta office building. So yeah, brick, terracotta, clay, it's not. Anyway. Now there's Sullivan Building. And so I got talking. And it's almost time to go. You guys have any questions? Did I bore you? No, okay, well, then we're good. I'll see you guys on Wednesday then.
So that I can verify, can I like to move it again?
Well, that's still an A and you're doing pretty well, so.
But I
Just
can't.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Fix what I wrote on.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.